Hey everyone! Before we dive into this incredible story of survival against impossible odds in the Rocky Mountain wilderness, I've got to ask, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. Last time we had viewers from everywhere, Seattle to Stockholm, Texas to Tokyo. The fact that we can connect across continents while learning about these mountain men who lived in complete isolation really blows my mind. Whether you're cozy in bed in London at 2 a.m., having morning coffee in California, or taking a lunch break in Sydney, I love seeing our global community come together for these stories. Plus, it's always fascinating to see how different time zones bring different energy to the comments. Alright, now that we've got that out of the way, let's transport ourselves back to 1837, to a world where survival meant something completely different than it does today. The winter's embrace, a mountain man's testament, a different voice from the frozen wilderness. Listen closely, friend, for I have a tale to tell. Not of heroes and villains, but of ordinary men who faced extraordinary cold and lived to speak of it. This is the story of survival at its most elemental, told through the eyes of those who danced with death every winter night in the Rocky Mountains during the most perilous decades of American frontier expansion. What you're about to hear isn't romanticized nonsense about noble savages and cozy cabins with smoking chimneys. This is the raw truth about what it meant to survive in conditions that would kill a modern person within minutes. It's about the sophisticated engineering that rough-hewn men developed using nothing but hand tools and desperate necessity. It's about the psychological techniques that kept minds intact during months of soul-crushing isolation. And it's about the thin line between life and death that every mountain man walked each day from October through April. I tell this story not for glory. There was precious little of that in our daily existence. But because the knowledge these men developed deserves to survive. In an age when we've insulated ourselves from nature's raw power, perhaps there's wisdom to be found in understanding how our predecessors faced challenges that would humble our modern conveniences. So settle yourself comfortably, more comfortably than any mountain man ever could during winter months, and let me transport you to a time when survival depended not on technology, but on intimate knowledge of natural systems, meticulous preparation, and the kind of mental toughness that could endure anything the mountains decided to unleash. Chapter 1. The Awakening of Understanding. Picture, if you will, the moment when consciousness returns not to the gentle comfort of heated homes and electric lights, but to the immediate visceral recognition of mortal danger lurking mere inches beyond your shelter's walls. Such was my awakening on that February morning in 1837, when the blizzard that would later claim 7 trappers' lives across the territory had just begun its merciless assault on our mountain refuge. But before I tell you about that particular morning, which nearly became my last, let me paint a proper picture of what brought men like me to this frozen hell in the first place. You see, the Rocky Mountain fur trade wasn't just an economic venture, it was the collision point between expanding American ambition and a wilderness so hostile that it actively tried to kill anyone foolish enough to enter it during winter months. The year 1837 was already well into what historians would later call the golden age of the mountain man, though I can assure you there was nothing golden about freezing your backside off in a log shelter, while 40 below temperatures turned your breath into ice crystals before they could travel 6 inches from your mouth. By that time, the beaver trade had been going strong for nearly 2 decades, drawing men from every corner of civilized America into the Rockies' embrace. My name was William Joshua Hartwell, though most folks called me Bill, and I could be any of the 3,000 souls who ventured into these peaks between 1820 and 1840. chasing beaver pelts, and a peculiar brand of freedom that could only be found at the ragged edge of survival. I was 28 years old that winter, originally from a small farming community outside Pittsburgh, where the idea of deliberately spending winter in the Rockies would have been considered evidence of severe mental deficiency. But I'd been in the mountains for 6 years by then, long enough to have learned from Samuel Mackenzie, Old Sam as everyone called him, and long enough to understand that what separated the living from the dead in this country wasn't luck, courage, or even skill with a rifle. It was knowledge. Knowledge of how to read weather patterns that could shift from tolerable to deadly in under an hour. Knowledge of how to construct shelters that could maintain livable temperatures when the outside world became hostile to human life. And perhaps most importantly, knowledge of how to maintain mental equilibrium during months of isolation that could drive lesser men to madness. The consciousness that greeted me that particular morning was sharp and immediate, cutting through the fog of sleep like a well-honed skinning knife. There was darkness, complete and absolute in the way that only exists in remote places hundreds of miles from the nearest oil lamp. There was bitter cold slapping my exposed face like nature's own judgment, reminding me that even the small portion of my anatomy left uncovered by buffalo robes was under constant assault from temperatures that could freeze flesh solid. And beneath me, spreading across the raised wooden platform that served as my bed, were the blessed layers of buffalo robes that represented the difference between waking up and never waking up again. The temperature inside our crude shelter hovered somewhere around the freezing point, a magnificent victory when measured against the -30 degrees that was even now howling and shrieking its fury just beyond our walls. But victories in mountain winters are measured in minutes, not hours, and every mountain man learns that comfort is always temporary, always fragile, always dependent on systems that require constant attention and maintenance. The sound that had torn me from sleep was unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time in high country during winter. Wind with that particular quality of shriek that speaks not of ordinary weather, but of the kind of storm that kills, not the gentle whoosh of summer breezes moving through pine boughs, but the banshee wail of air moving at speeds that could knock a full-grown man off his feet, carrying temperatures that froze exposed flesh in under an hour, and wind chill factors that made the actual temperature reading seem warm by comparison. I knew, even before my eyes had fully adjusted to the darkness, that our stone fireplace was burning dangerously low. After 6 years in the mountains, you develop an almost supernatural awareness of fire conditions. The sound it makes, the way heat radiates through the shelter, the quality of light reflecting off log walls, all of these become as familiar as your own heartbeat. And what I was sensing told me that our single source of heat, the cornerstone upon which our survival depended, was in danger of failing. If those coals died completely during the night, I might never see another sunrise. It was that simple, that stark, that unforgiving. Fire dies, you die, Samuel Mackenzie's voice echoed in my memory, spoken in that matter-of-fact tone he used for dispensing the kind of wisdom that kept greenhorns alive through their first mountain winter. Old Sam, by 1837, he'd survived 17 Rocky Mountain winters, an achievement that put him in a class with maybe a dozen other men in the entire territory. He'd watched hundreds of other trappers make that one critical mistake that the mountains never forgive, and he'd learned from every one of their failures. There were no second chances in this realm, no margin for error, no rescue teams or emergency services. No neighbours you could call upon when things went wrong, no doctors to treat frostbite or hypothermia, No supply stores where you could purchase replacement gear when yours failed. Just your knowledge, your preparation, your equipment, and whatever refuge you could build with your own two hands using materials that the wilderness provided. So there I was that morning, congratulations to me, a mountain man in winter's deepest, most merciless grip. And my first task before even considering the luxury of breakfast was ensuring I'd live long enough to eat it. The irony wasn't lost on me that in my former life back in Pennsylvania, my biggest morning concern had been whether the barn needed mucking or if the corn needed harvesting. Now my first conscious thought every day was calculating whether I had enough firewood to last until the next opportunity to gather more, and whether the chinking between our logs was tight enough to keep out the kind of wind that could steal body heat faster than a fire could replace it. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Survival More Than Logs and Stones. Now, before you paint some romantic picture of log cabins with rocking chairs and cozy porches, the kind of nonsense that Eastern newspapers love to print about our rustic frontier lifestyle, let me correct that fantasy immediately and completely. What I sheltered within that morning was far more sophisticated and infinitely less comfortable than any such idyllic scene could suggest. The structure that kept me alive was what we called a life support machine, though we didn't use such fancy terminology back then. Think of it instead as a carefully engineered survival system, constructed entirely from logs, stones, and animal hides, designed by men who understood that a single mistake in planning or construction could mean death when the next blizzard arrived. Sophisticated? You might scoff, observing the rough-hewn log walls, the dirt floor packed hard as stone from months of foot traffic, the crude furniture that looked like it had been assembled by someone with more enthusiasm than skill. That skepticism would immediately mark you as a greenhorn destined for a shallow grave come spring. These shelters represented marvels of engineering, especially considering their construction using nothing but axes, knives, hand saws, and survival knowledge earned through generations of trial, error, and frequently death. Let me tell you about the construction of the shelter that saved my life that winter, because understanding its sophistication requires understanding the months of preparation that went into its creation. Sam and I had started work on it the previous July, when temperatures were still pleasant, and the idea of -30-degree weather seemed like a distant nightmare. The fire in our stone fireplace wasn't comfort. It was our life support system, as essential to our survival as a beating heart. Without it maintaining interior temperature, the space would quickly match the Arctic nightmare beyond our walls, and we'd become just 2 more corpses for spring travelers to discover when the snow melted. I pushed aside the buffalo robes, each one representing hours of hunting, skinning, and preparation during the previous fall. These weren't simple blankets, but carefully selected and prepared hides from mature buffalo cows, chosen for their thickness and insulating properties. The underside of each robe was soft and pliable from proper tanning, while the outer side retained enough of the original texture to shed moisture and resist wear. Swinging my legs over the sleeping platform's edge, I felt for the rough leather moccasins that I'd positioned precisely for this moment the night before. These weren't the decorative moccasins you might see in a general store, but working footwear crafted from elk hide and lined with rabbit fur, designed to provide insulation while allowing enough flexibility for the kind of precise movements required for fire tending in cramped quarters. Even those few seconds of contact between bare feet and that dirt floor would steal precious body heat that my body had worked all night to generate and conserve. The floor itself was another example of mountain engineering, Not just dirt, but a carefully prepared surface that had been excavated to below the frost line, filled with layers of gravel for drainage, then packed with a mixture of clay and organic matter that dried into a surface nearly as hard as wood but with better insulating properties. My shoulder wound chose that moment to remind me of its presence, sending sharp tendrils of pain down my arm. An old injury from a Blackfoot arrow that had punched through muscle and scraped bone during a hunting expedition gone wrong the previous summer. The wound had healed, after a fashion, but it never seemed to heal completely, leaving me with what Sam called a personal weather station. When atmospheric pressure dropped and storms approached, that old injury would throb and ache with the reliability of a well-made chronometer. It was throbbing now, which meant the storm outside was going to be a significant one. In my 6 years in the mountains, I'd learned to trust that shoulder more than any other weather indicator. It had never been wrong about approaching severe weather, and it was telling me now that we were in for several days of conditions that would make travel impossible and outdoor work potentially fatal. I made my way across the small interior of our shelter to the fireplace, moving carefully in the dim light provided by the glowing coals. Every step was deliberate, practiced, efficient. In a space roughly 12 feet by 16 feet, there was no room for wasted motion or careless stumbling that might upset carefully arranged supplies or damage essential equipment. The woodpile beside our fireplace represented weeks of preparation and careful selection. These weren't random sticks gathered haphazardly, but precisely chosen pieces of wood, each one cut to specific lengths and sorted by size and burning characteristics. The wood had been seasoned for months, stored in a location that kept it dry while allowing air circulation to remove moisture that would make it difficult to ignite and inefficient to burn. I selected a piece of split pine, not too large, lest it smother the struggling coals that represented our lifeline to survival, and not too small, or it would burn through too quickly, forcing me to repeat the process before the larger wood had time to catch properly. This was survival science, refined through generations of trial and error, and getting the calculation wrong could mean the difference between a warm shelter and a frozen tomb. The technique for reviving a fire from dying coals was as precise as any scientific procedure. First, you arranged kindling in a specific pattern that allowed air to flow freely while providing maximum surface area for the coals to ignite. Then, you added progressively larger pieces in a sequence that maintained proper airflow while building heat gradually. Rush the process, and you'd smother the fire. Move too slowly, and the coals would die before the kindling caught. As I worked, blowing gently on the coals to encourage them back to life, I thought about the hundreds of mornings just like this one that had played out across the Rocky Mountains over the past 2 decades. In shelters scattered across thousands of square miles of wilderness, other mountain men were performing this same ritual, this daily dance with death that began each day with the simple question, would the fire light, or would this be the morning when the cold finally won? Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. Understanding the mountain's fury. But let me step back and answer the question that surely puzzles anyone who's never felt the call of the wilderness. What manner of man volunteers for this frozen hell? What could possibly drive someone to leave the relative comfort and safety of civilization for an existence where death lurked around every corner and comfort was measured not in luxury but in simply staying alive through another night? The answer lies in understanding what America was like in the 1820s and 1830s, when the beaver trade was transforming both the economy and the geography of a rapidly expanding nation. Between 1820 and 1840, roughly 3,000 men ventured into the Rocky Mountains, but they weren't just random adventurers seeking thrills. They represented a unique convergence of economic opportunity, social displacement, and the particularly American belief that any man with sufficient courage and determination could carve out his own destiny, regardless of what obstacles nature placed in his path. These men shared a common obsession that drove them to risk everything: beaver pelts. In those days, beaver fur commanded prices that made it nearly as valuable as gold, ounce for ounce. European and Eastern American fashion demanded it for those stylish felt hats that marked gentlemen of society. A top hat made from beaver felt could cost more than a working man's monthly wages, and the demand seemed inexhaustible. For a skilled trapper operating in virgin territory, the financial potential was staggering. A good season could yield pelts worth more than a factory worker would earn in 5 years. Men who'd grown up on hard-scrabble farms or in crowded eastern cities could see beaver as their ticket to independence, wealth, and a kind of freedom that simply didn't exist in more settled parts of the country. But the financial incentive was enormous. So too was the mortality rate. For every man who struck it rich in the beaver trade, 3 or 4 others left their bones scattered across the mountain wilderness. The mountains didn't care about your dreams of wealth or your need for freedom. They operated according to laws that were older and more merciless than any human institution. The mountain men weren't random dudes with death wishes, as some folks liked to characterize them. They represented a unique mixture of backgrounds and motivations, but all shared certain characteristics that made them suited for wilderness survival. There were French-Canadian voyageurs who'd learned wilderness skills in the Northern Territories, men who could paddle a canoe through whitewater rapids, and who understood how to live off the land during extended expeditions. There were American frontiersmen who'd grown up on the edges of civilization, men who'd learned to hunt and trap as children, and who saw the Rocky Mountains as simply the next frontier to be conquered. There were European immigrants drawn by promises of wealth and freedom, men who'd risked everything to come to America and were willing to risk everything again for a chance at real prosperity. There were also men running from something: debts, failed relationships, legal troubles, or simply the confining expectations of civilized society. The mountains offered a kind of anonymity and fresh start that was impossible to find anywhere else in America. Out here, your past didn't matter. What mattered was whether you could survive your first winter, and whether you could learn quickly enough to avoid the mistakes that killed so many others. But freedom in these mountains came with a price that was paid in knowledge, preparation, and frequently blood. The learning curve was steep and unforgiving. Make a mistake in site selection for your winter shelter, and you'd freeze to death before Christmas. Fail to properly prepare and store enough firewood, and you'd burn your furniture and then your cabin before starving or freezing. Underestimate the psychological toll of months of isolation, and you might survive physically only to lose your mind. You know what separates the corpses from the survivors, old Sam would say, poking at dying fires with the kind of practice stick he'd used for this purpose so many times that it had developed a groove worn smooth by his thumb. It ain't luck, and it ain't toughness, and it sure as hell ain't how good you can shoot. He'd pause here for emphasis, the way he always did when imparting the kind of wisdom that could mean the difference between life and death. Sam understood the dramatic value of a well-timed pause, especially when teaching young men whose lives might depend on remembering his lessons during some future crisis. It's knowing where to build, he'd continue, his eyes scanning the landscape with the kind of professional assessment that came from 17 winters of choosing shelter locations. Everything else is just details. Get your location wrong, and all the wood cutting and chinking and fancy fireplace construction in the world won't save you when the real storms hit. And there lay the fundamental truth that would shock most people then and now. The entire foundation of mountain survival wasn't about physical strength, shooting accuracy, or even knowledge of hunting and trapping techniques. It was about real estate. Location, location, location. The difference between life and death began with choosing the right spot for your shelter, and a poor choice could doom you before you'd even begun construction. One wrong choice, like selecting a position prone to avalanches or in a natural wind tunnel, and you'd be finished before the first major storm arrived. I'd seen the evidence of such mistakes scattered across the mountains, collapsed shelters, scattered gear, and the occasional grim discovery of human remains that told the story of someone who'd chosen poorly and paid the ultimate price for their error in judgment. The site selection process wasn't something you could rush or take lightly. It required weeks of observation, careful study of weather patterns, and an understanding of how the local terrain would affect wind, snow accumulation, drainage, and access to essential resources like water and firewood. You had to think not just about where you wanted to spend the winter, but about how that location would behave during the worst possible weather conditions. Chapter 4, Reading the Mountains Language, the Science of Site Selection. Site selection wasn't just the most critical decision in mountain shelter construction. It was literally the most critical decision in determining whether you'd see spring, whether you'd survive long enough to enjoy the profits from your winter's trapping, or whether you'd become another cautionary tale told around campfires by men who'd learned from your mistakes. These men weren't seeking pretty views or locations that would provide good sketching opportunities for landscape artists. They were reading the landscape like a survival manual written in topography, vegetation patterns and weather signs. A manual that had been authored by forces far more powerful and unforgiving than any human intelligence. The knowledge required for proper site selection was vast and interconnected, touching on subjects that wouldn't be formally studied by academics for decades to come. Mountain men had to understand meteorology without having access to weather instruments, comprehend principles of structural engineering without any formal training, and master concepts of thermal dynamics using nothing but observation and hard-won experience. Natural wind protection topped their priority list, but understanding wind patterns in mountain terrain required knowledge that went far beyond simply noting which direction the wind was blowing on any given day. Mountain men had to understand how topography created wind channels, how seasonal patterns shifted prevailing wind directions, and how different types of storms would interact with local terrain to create unique hazards. The ideal location would nestle on a hill's southeast side, shielded from those prevailing northwest winter winds that could drive temperatures down to levels that froze spit before it hit the ground. But finding such a location required weeks of observation, noting how wind patterns changed throughout the day, how they shifted with changing weather, and how the surrounding terrain would amplify or deflect wind during different types of storms. Mountain men positioned their shelters behind rock formations that had been shaped by thousands of years of wind and weather, dense tree groves that had grown in specific patterns that indicated consistent wind protection, or natural terrain features that had proven their effectiveness by the vegetation patterns they supported. You could read the story of local wind patterns in the shape of the trees, the way snow accumulated in certain areas, and the patterns of erosion on exposed rock faces. Wind kills faster than cold, Sam would explain with the authority of someone who'd seen both claim lives, often in combination. Cold takes hours to kill you if you're properly dressed and can find shelter, Wind takes minutes, even if you've got good gear. Wind strips heat away from your body faster than you can generate it, and once you lose core temperature, you're done for. Wind protection wasn't merely about comfort or convenience. It could reduce heating requirements by up to 60%, while preventing the kind of structural damage that could compromise a shelter's integrity during critical periods. That difference often meant having sufficient firewood for the entire winter, versus freezing to death in January when supplies ran low and weather conditions made gathering more wood impossible. A sharp cracking sound from outside froze me in place as I worked to revive our fire. In the mountains during winter, every unexpected sound demanded immediate attention and careful evaluation. Survival instinct required distinguishing between harmless noises, like snow sliding off tree branches, and potentially dangerous ones that might indicate structural problems with the shelter, approaching wildlife, or human threats. Something was moving near our shelter, and experienced mountain men learned to identify threats before responding to them. Hasty reactions could be as dangerous as delayed ones. My Kentucky long rifle stood propped in the corner where I could reach it quickly, but grabbing for weapons before properly assessing a situation was the mark of a nervous greenhorn who probably wouldn't survive his first winter. The sound repeated, and this time I could identify it. Just a tree branch surrendering to the weight of accumulated snow. The distinctive crack and whoosh of wood breaking under load, followed by the soft thump of snow hitting the ground. Tension released from my shoulders, though only partially. Mountain life demanded constant vigilance, even for sounds that turned out to be harmless. After wind protection came avalanche assessment, a field of knowledge that was literally a matter of life and death, but which wouldn't be formally studied by scientists for another century. You'd be amazed how many trappers died not from cold, starvation, or conflicts with Native Americans, but from being buried alive when their own shelters became their tombs under tons of sliding snow. The avalanche that killed Jake Morrison and his partner in the winter of 1834 started as a minor snowslide high up on the mountain above their carefully constructed cabin. They'd done everything else right. Excellent wind protection, proper drainage, solid construction. But they'd built in what the local Crow Indians could have told them was a natural avalanche path. When the slide hit, it buried their shelter under 20 feet of snow mixed with broken trees and boulders. Their bodies weren't found until the following summer. Terrain analysis required understanding how topography affected wind patterns, how different slope angles would affect snow accumulation, how drainage patterns could indicate potential flooding during spring melt, and how the larger landscape would behave during different types of weather events. Mountain men had to study slope angles that could trigger avalanches, usually anything steeper than about 30 degrees, and identify wind channels that created dangerous downdrafts, capable of creating localized conditions far worse than the general weather pattern. They had to recognize terrain features that provided natural protection from prevailing storm patterns, understand how different elevations would affect temperature and precipitation, and identify signs that indicated unstable snow conditions or geological features that might pose long-term threats to a shelter's structural integrity. Mountain men avoided valley bottoms where cold air pooled like invisible lakes of death, creating temperature inversions that could make low-lying areas significantly colder than higher elevations. They also avoided ridgetops where wind exposure exceeded human endurance, and where a shelter would be subjected to the full force of every storm that passed through the region. The ideal site offered southern exposure for maximum solar heating during the brief daylight hours of winter, protection from prevailing winds that could strip away heat faster than any fire could replace it, and access to water sources that wouldn't freeze completely during winter months, a surprising challenge in country where temperatures regularly dropped low enough to freeze running water solid. I once asked an old-timer named Marcus Webb, who'd grown up hearing first-hand accounts from the last generation of mountain men, how they figured all this out without formal education or scientific instruments. Webb had spent his childhood listening to men who'd learned these techniques directly from the pioneers of mountain survival, and his answer gave me chills. "Trial and error," he replied with a grim smile that suggested he'd heard some stories that would keep you awake at night. Emphasis on the error. The mountains are littered with bones of men who got it wrong. Every technique you've learned, every bit of wisdom about site selection and shelter construction, was bought with somebody's life when they made a mistake. And that was the sobering truth about mountain survival knowledge. There existed no wilderness survival guidebook in those days, no formal training programs or safety courses. This knowledge was earned through generations of mistakes, near misses, and observing what happened to the less fortunate. Every successful technique had been developed in response to someone else's failure, often fatal failure. The successful mountain men weren't necessarily smarter or tougher than those who died. They were the ones who learned from others' fatal errors rather than making their own, who paid attention to the lessons that the mountains taught through harsh example, and who understood that humility in the face of natural forces was a survival trait rather than a character weakness. Chapter 5: The Foundation of Life. There existed no wilderness survival guidebook in those days. This knowledge was earned through generations of mistakes, near misses, and observing what happened to the less fortunate. Successful mountain men learned from others' fatal errors rather than making their own. I added another small log to our fire, watching flames catch and grow. Dancing light illuminated our shelter's interior, casting long shadows on walls that represented months of careful construction. Outside, wind screamed past, occasionally finding tiny gaps in our chinking and sending knife-like drafts cutting through the warming air. Drainage and foundation preparation occupied the next priority position. Mountain men selected sites with natural drainage, cleared organic matter that retained moisture, and created foundation systems elevating living areas above ground moisture, while providing stable support for heavy log construction. Get your floor wet in winter, you might as well dig your own grave, Old Sam would warn with the directness that kept greenhorns alive. Proper drainage prevented ice formation that could destabilize foundations and eliminated moisture problems, creating unhealthy living conditions. A wet floor meant wet clothing, wet bedding, and eventually hypothermia. The fire caught nicely now, and I felt heat beginning to push back against the cold. My fingers, stiff and painful moments before, started regaining sensation. I flexed them carefully, knowing that too much heat too quickly could prove almost as painful as the cold itself. Chapter 6: Engineering without engineers. The next critical element involved snow load calculations. Actual engineering calculations performed through empirical knowledge gained from years of observing how different construction techniques performed under extreme conditions. Mountain men understood that roofs needed to support snow loads up to 100 pounds per square foot, while maintaining structural integrity during wind events that could create uneven loading patterns. They designed roof angles promoting snow shedding while maintaining structural strength under maximum loading conditions. Imagine that. No calculators, no structural engineering degrees, just knowledge passed down and refined through observation, and sometimes deadly consequences, I heard a voice echoing in memory, something my mentor told me years ago when I first arrived at the mountains as a greenhorn. Build your roof too flat, snow piles up. Build it too steep, wind tears it off. There's a sweet spot in between, and you better find it before the first storm. Structural engineering principles were applied using traditional knowledge tested through generations of mountain survival. Mountain men didn't call it engineering, but that's exactly what it was. Log selection focused on species providing maximum strength-to-weight ratios, proper seasoning that prevented cracking and settling, and construction techniques creating interlocking joints capable of withstanding extreme temperature cycling and structural loads. They preferred lodgepole pine and Douglas fir for their strength characteristics and resistance to temperature-related movement. Not just any tree would suffice. Greenwood would shrink as it dried, creating gaps in walls. Wood that was too dry might prove brittle and crack under stress. Each log was selected with purpose. "You know what most new fellows get wrong?" Sam once asked me, not waiting for an answer. "They think any log will do, but choosing the wrong wood is like choosing the wrong horse. It'll let you down when you need it most." Chapter 7. The Science of Stones. Foundation systems represented another crucial component. Mountain men built foundations using stone and timber construction that created stable, well-drained bases for log structures. They elevated living areas above snow level, provided thermal breaks preventing ground heat loss, and created stable platforms supporting heavy log walls without settling or shifting during freeze-thaw cycles. Stone foundations were carefully fitted without mortar, allowing for thermal movement while maintaining structural stability. This proved crucial because extreme temperature variations in mountain environments would cause rigid structures to crack and fail. These men understood thermal expansion and contraction concepts centuries before many formal engineers incorporated them into building codes. They knew that structures unable to flex with temperature changes would eventually tear themselves apart. The blizzard outside intensified, wind howling like a pack of wolves. I felt grateful for the solid walls surrounding us, for the knowledge that went into selecting each log, each stone. Our lives depended on decisions made months ago when weather was fair and winter seemed distant. Material procurement and preparation required understanding which local materials provided the best construction properties for extreme weather applications. Mountain men selected trees during specific seasons when sap content was lowest. Seasoned logs using natural drying techniques that prevented cracking, and prepared construction materials using hand tools that created precise joints and connections. Essentially, there was a right time of year to cut trees, a right way to dry them, and a right way to shape them. Get any part wrong, and your shelter might fail midwinter. I settled back onto my sleeping platform, pulling buffalo robes around me. The fire crackled pleasantly now, casting a warm glow throughout our shelter. Outside, the blizzard raged, but in here, we remained safe, for now. Chapter 8. The Heart of Heat. As I drifted towards sleep, I contemplated the knowledge and work that went into this shelter. The careful site selection, the precise engineering, the materials chosen for their specific properties. None of it was random. All of it was essential. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Checking the roof for snow load, inspecting chinking between logs, gathering more firewood. Because winter in the mountains forgave neither carelessness nor complacency, this was merely the beginning of understanding how mountain men survived Earth's deadliest winters. Their knowledge of thermal engineering, heating systems, and heat retention proved just as sophisticated as their structural engineering, perhaps even more so. The fire popped, sending a spark dancing across the dirt floor. It died quickly, but not before reminding me of mountain life's central truth. Fire meant life, and in the mountains, life was never guaranteed. I woke several hours later, not to howling wind, but to bone-deep cold that signalled our fire had burned down to embers. Darkness was absolute, that special pitch black existing only in remote places without electric lights for hundreds of miles. My breath hung visible in the air. Buffalo robes had kept me from freezing, but just barely. The storm outside hadn't relented. If anything, it had intensified. I could hear wind's low moan as it searched for any crack in our shelter's defences. Fire dies, you die. Old Sam's words echoed again. Time to move fast. I swung my legs over the sleeping platform's edge, sliding feet into fur-lined moccasins strategically placed before sleeping. The floor was cold enough to steal body heat through my feet in minutes. The fireplace held a bed of glowing coals, still alive, but barely. This was the night's most critical moment. If I couldn't revive that fire quickly, interior temperature would plummet to match the deadly cold outside. Chapter 5. The Foundation of Life, Engineering in the Wilderness. There existed no wilderness survival guidebook in those days, no Sierra Club manuals or government pamphlets explaining the principles of high-altitude shelter construction. This knowledge was earned through generations of mistakes, near misses, and observing what happened to the less fortunate. A brutal but effective educational system where graduation meant survival and failure meant death. The process of learning mountain survival was unlike any other form of education. In cities and settled areas, mistakes might be embarrassing or costly, but they were rarely fatal. In the mountains during winter, there was no margin for error, no opportunity to repeat failed experiments, no chance to apply lessons learned from personal mistakes. You had to learn from watching others, from listening to the stories of survivors, and from developing an almost supernatural sensitivity to the signs that nature provided. I added another small log to our fire, watching as flames caught and grew with the peculiar satisfaction that came from successfully completing a task upon which your life depended. Dancing light illuminated our shelter's interior, casting long shadows on walls that represented months of careful construction and an investment of knowledge that had been accumulated over decades of mountain experience. The walls themselves told a story of sophisticated engineering adapted to wilderness conditions. Each log had been selected not just for its size and straightness, but for its species, seasoning, and structural properties. The way they fit together represented an understanding of wood behavior under extreme temperature variations that wouldn't be formally studied by engineers for another century. Outside, wind screamed past with a fury that seemed almost personal, occasionally finding tiny gaps in our chinking and sending knife-like drafts cutting through the warming air. These small infiltrations of cold air served as reminders that our shelter's integrity depended on constant maintenance, and that the battle between human engineering and natural forces was never truly won, only temporarily held in check. Chapter 6. The Mathematics of Survival. Drainage and foundation preparation occupied the next priority position in our construction timeline, and this represented another area where mountain men had developed sophisticated techniques that wouldn't be understood by formal engineering until much later. Mountain men selected sites with natural drainage that would carry away snowmelt and rainwater, cleared organic matter that could retain moisture and create rot problems, and created foundation systems that elevated living areas above ground moisture while providing stable support for heavy log construction. The foundation work had been back-breaking labour performed during the hottest part of summer, digging and moving stone in temperatures that often exceeded 90 degrees. But that discomfort was nothing compared to what would happen if we'd skipped this crucial step. A poorly drained foundation could create ice problems that would destabilize the entire structure, moisture issues that would rot the wood and create gaps in our walls, and frost heave problems that could literally tear the shelter apart during freeze-thaw cycles. Get your floor wet in winter, you might as well dig your own grave, Old Sam would warn with the kind of directness that kept greenhorns alive through their first mountain winter. Water in winter means ice, and ice means your foundation's going to shift and crack. Once that happens, you're living in a drafty ice house instead of a warm shelter. Proper drainage prevented ice formation that could destabilize foundations and eliminated moisture problems that could create unhealthy living conditions leading to respiratory problems, frostbite from constant dampness, and the kind of persistent cold that could sap your strength and will to live. A wet floor meant wet clothing, wet bedding, and eventually hypothermia. A death spiral that started with seemingly minor moisture problems and ended with your corpse being discovered by spring travellers. The fire was catching nicely now, and I could feel heat beginning to push back against the cold that had invaded our shelter during the night. My fingers, stiff and painful moments before, started regaining sensation with the peculiar tingling that accompanied the return of circulation. I flexed them carefully, working through the stiffness, knowing that too much heat too quickly could prove almost as painful as the cold itself. Chapter 7. The Enemy Within. Understanding Cold Injury. Frostbite was a constant concern during winter months, and experienced mountain men learned to recognize the early signs and treat them before permanent damage occurred. The tingling in my fingers was normal, a sign that circulation was returning properly. But if the sensation had been absent, if my fingers had remained numb despite the warming, that would have indicated frostbite damage that could cost me digits or even entire hands. I'd seen men lose fingers, toes, and worse to frostbite. Jake Hendricks lost 3 toes during his second winter because he'd ignored the early warning signs and continued working outside in wet boots during a cold snap. The toes had turned black and eventually fell off, leaving him with balance problems that plagued him for the rest of his life. Worse, the injury had made him vulnerable to future cold injury, since damaged tissue was more susceptible to freezing. The prevention of cold injury required constant vigilance and an understanding of how cold affected different parts of the body. Extremities, fingers, toes, nose, ears were most vulnerable because they received less blood flow when the body was trying to conserve core temperature. But cold injury could also affect larger areas if you weren't careful about clothing management and heat exposure. Mountain men learned to warm cold body parts gradually, never exposing frostbitten tissue to direct heat from fires, and to recognize the difference between normal cold discomfort and the dangerous numbness that indicated tissue damage. They also learned to keep extra clothing dry and accessible, since wet clothing in winter conditions was often a death sentence. Chapter 8. The Science of Layering. The process of getting dressed each morning during winter required as much planning and care as any other survival activity. Clothing had to be layered properly to provide insulation while allowing moisture transfer, sized correctly to avoid restriction of circulation, and maintained constantly to ensure it continued to provide protection when you needed it most. My winter clothing system consisted of multiple layers, each designed for specific conditions and activities. Next to my skin, I wore a shirt made from wool that had been woven tightly enough to provide insulation, but loosely enough to allow air circulation. Over that, a heavier wool sweater that provided additional insulation and could be removed if I became too warm during physical activity. On my legs, wool long underwear covered by heavy wool pants, with leather chaps over everything to provide wind protection and durability during outdoor work. Wool was preferred for base layers because it retained insulating properties, even when damp, unlike cotton, which became useless when wet and could actually accelerate heat loss. My feet required special attention, since frostbitten feet could make travel impossible and strand you in a location where you might not have adequate supplies to survive. Wool socks provided insulation, but they had to be changed regularly to prevent moisture buildup that could lead to frostbite or trench foot. Over the socks, leather moccasins lined with rabbit fur provided insulation, while allowing enough sensitivity to feel the ground beneath my feet. In extreme conditions, I could add additional layers, another pair of socks, overboots made from treated leather, or even improvised foot warmers made from heated stones wrapped in cloth. The key was having multiple options and the knowledge to use them appropriately as conditions changed. Hand protection was equally critical, since frostbitten hands couldn't perform the detailed work required for fire maintenance, equipment repair, or food preparation. I used a layered system for hands as well. Thin wool gloves that allowed dexterity for detailed work, covered by heavier mittens that provided maximum warmth during outdoor activity. Mittens were generally warmer than gloves because they allowed fingers to share heat, but gloves were necessary for tasks that required individual finger movement. Experienced mountain men learned to switch quickly between different types of hand protection as tasks and conditions demanded. The key to successful winter clothing was understanding that your body was constantly generating heat and moisture, and your clothing system had to manage both while protecting you from external cold and wind. Too many layers could cause overheating and dangerous moisture build-up. Too few layers left you vulnerable to rapid heat loss that could become life-threatening in minutes. Mountain men learned to adjust their clothing throughout the day as activity levels and weather conditions changed. Before beginning strenuous work like woodcutting, they'd remove outer layers to prevent overheating. Before periods of inactivity, they'd add layers to maintain body temperature. This constant adjustment required experience and attention, but it was essential for maintaining comfort and avoiding cold injury. The next critical element in shelter construction was snow load calculations. Actual engineering calculations performed through empirical knowledge gained from years of observing how different construction techniques performed under extreme conditions. Mountain men understood that roofs needed to support snow loads up to 100 pounds per square foot, while maintaining structural integrity during wind events that could create uneven loading patterns that would stress the structure in ways that static loads never could. What most people don't realize is that creating and maintaining life-sustaining temperatures in remote mountain shelters required sophisticated understanding of heat generation, distribution, and retention, using only natural materials and primitive heating systems. No thermostat dials to turn, no backup generators, just your knowledge and whatever you could build with your hands. Thomas Whitaker, a mountain man who survived the brutal winter of 1832, once described it. Out there, your fireplace ain't just for comfort. It's the beating heart of your shelter. Build it wrong, and you'll freeze with a roaring fire burning. I knelt by the fireplace, feeling faint heat from remaining coals. This fireplace's design wasn't random. It resulted from generations of trial and error, where errors meant death. Fireplace construction formed the heart of mountain shelter heating systems, but these weren't decorative smoke-belching fireplaces you might find in modern cabins. Mountain men built fireplaces using local stone carefully selected for its ability to withstand extreme temperature cycling without cracking. I grabbed several small pieces of kindling from the neatly stacked pile beside the fireplace, not random sticks, but specifically prepared and sorted by size to create perfect progression from spark to flame. I arranged them carefully over coals, creating tiny air spaces between each piece. Proper fireplace design included combustion chambers sized for efficient burning, chimney systems creating proper draft while preventing heat loss, and thermal mass systems that stored heat during active burning and released it slowly over extended periods. The trick ain't just making fire, old Sam once told a greenhorn struggling to stay warm despite burning through firewood at alarming rates. The trick is making the fire work for you. Most fools just make smoke and warm the sky. Chapter 10. The Hidden Sophistication. I blew gently on embers, coaxing them back to life. A small flame appeared, dancing along kindling's edge. I fed it carefully, gradually adding larger pieces as the fire grew. Chimney design and construction required understanding draft principles, heat retention, and structural stability under extreme temperature conditions. Mountain men built chimneys using stone construction that could withstand thermal cycling, created proper draft angles ensuring efficient combustion, and incorporated heat exchange systems that captured waste heat before it escaped through the chimney. Wait, did you catch that? Heat exchange systems. Yes, these primitive mountain men were building heat exchangers into their chimneys, running smoke through chambers of stone or clay before it exited. They extracted maximum heat from every precious piece of firewood. See how this chimney narrows here, then widens there, Sam would explain, pointing to carefully shaped structures. That ain't random. That's so heat can't escape too fast. Makes your wood last twice as long. They understood that proper chimney design could increase heating efficiency by up to 40%, while preventing dangerous backdrafts and carbon monoxide accumulation. Get it wrong, and you'd either freeze or suffocate. The fire was catching properly now, growing stronger. I added more wood, slightly larger pieces this time. Warmth began pushing back against cold, and I could feel sensation returning to fingers and toes. Picture this. 35 below zero outside, wind howling at 60 miles per hour, but inside a well-built mountain shelter, temperature hovers around a comfortable 65 degrees. How was that possible with just a fireplace and no insulation as we know it today? Chapter 11, Natural Thermal Batteries. The answer lay in thermal mass systems. Mountain men used stone and clay construction that could absorb heat during active burning periods and release stored thermal energy over many hours after fires died down. I looked at large stones comprising our fireplace. They weren't just structural, they were functional. During the day, when fire burned hot, these stones absorbed that heat. At night, when fire burned lower, they released it back into the shelter. Natural thermal batteries. Mountain men positioned thermal mass strategically throughout shelters to create even heat distribution, while maximizing heat storage capacity, using materials readily available in wilderness environments. They calculated thermal mass requirements based on shelter size, insulation levels, and expected heating loads during extreme weather conditions. You want stones that hold heat, Sam would say, tapping particular rocks with his knuckle. Not all rocks are the same. Some hold heat like a miser holds gold. Others let it slip away like water through fingers. He was right. Different stone types have different thermal mass properties. Soapstone has excellent heat retention. Granite is decent. Sandstone, not so much. Mountain men knew which stones would best serve as heat batteries long before thermal conductivity science was formally understood. The fire roared now, filling our shelter with blessed warmth and golden light. I could see my breath less and less as temperature rose. Chill retreated from my bones. Chapter 12. The Art of Heat Distribution. What about heat distribution? It wasn't enough to have a hot fire in one corner if the rest of your shelter remained freezing. Heat distribution systems used natural convection and radiant heating principles to move warm air throughout shelter spaces. Mountain men designed interior layouts that promoted air circulation while preventing heat loss through poorly sealed openings. Strategic placement of thermal mass and heating elements created convection currents that distributed heat evenly throughout living spaces. I noticed how our sleeping platform was positioned, elevated above the floor but not too close to the ceiling. This was intentional. Since warm air rises, the highest point in any shelter would be warmest. Too high, and you'd sweat while sleeping. Too low, and you'd freeze. The platform was placed at exactly the right height to maintain comfortable sleeping temperature. 3 feet off the ground, Sam would say. Any higher and you'll bake like bread. Any lower and you'll freeze like meat. They understood that proper heat distribution could eliminate cold spots and reduce overall fuel consumption by up to 30%. Every piece of firewood saved meant one more day of survival when storms made gathering more impossible. Chapter 13. The Chemistry of Combustion. Now let's discuss combustion efficiency, because not all fires are created equal. Mountain men maximized it through proper fuel selection, fire management techniques, and combustion chamber design that extracted maximum heat from available fuel while minimizing smoke production and heat loss. I had arranged logs in our fireplace in a specific pattern, not the teepee shape most casual campers use, but a carefully structured arrangement allowing proper airflow and sustained burning. "Look at these city folks," Sam would laugh, watching eastern hunters struggle with smoky, inefficient campfires. "They think any stick'll burn the same. There's wood that heats, and there's wood that just makes smoke. Know the difference or freeze to death with a roaring fire." Mountain men understood which wood species provided best heat output, how to season and prepare fuel for optimal burning, and how to manage fires for continuous heat production. They knew hardwoods like oak and maple provided long-burning coals, while softwoods like pine provided quick ignition and high heat output. I thought about our wood pile stacked against the wall. Each piece was selected, cut, and stored with purpose. Smaller pieces of pine for quick hot fires, larger chunks of oak and maple for overnight burning. Nothing random about it. A particularly strong gust of wind made our shelter creak. Something shifted on the roof, probably snow sliding off thanks to the steepened roof angle. The sound made me think about how much wood we had left. Chapter 30. The Deepening Storm. Throughout that night, the wind intensified into something far beyond what I'd initially predicted. What had begun as a moderate storm developed into a full mountain blizzard, with wind speeds that made our carefully constructed shelter vibrate like a struck bell. This was the kind of storm that tested every aspect of our survival systems. The physical engineering of our shelter, the adequacy of our supply preparations, and perhaps most critically, the psychological resilience required to remain calm when nature demonstrated its absolute power. The temperature dropped precipitously as the storm intensified. My breath began to form visible clouds inside the shelter, despite the fire burning steadily. This was a dangerous sign. It meant the outside temperature had fallen to levels that challenged even our sophisticated thermal management systems. The thermal mass of our stone fireplace worked overtime to radiate stored heat, while the insulation properties of our double wall construction were tested to their limits. I could hear trees falling in the distance, massive evergreens that had stood for decades finally succumbing to wind loads they couldn't withstand. Each distant crash reminded me how fortunate we were to have selected our building site so carefully, choosing a location protected by the natural windbreak of the hillside and clear of any large trees that might fall across our shelter. The sound of the storm was unlike anything I'd experienced, even after months in the mountains. It wasn't just wind, it was a full symphony of winter's fury. The howling of air forced through mountain passes mixed with the percussive impacts of driven snow against our walls. Occasionally larger debris, branches, chunks of ice or snow masses blown from distant peaks, would strike our roof with sounds like artillery fire, but our shelter held. Every joint remained tight, every seal kept the weather outside where it belonged. The engineering principles that Sam had taught me, refined through generations of mountain men facing these same challenges, proved their worth against nature's ultimate test. "Storm like this separates the dead from the living," Sam had told me during my first winter, as we'd weathered a similar blizzard in his shelter. "Man who built right keeps warm and dry. Man who built wrong becomes another story other folks tell around the fire." I maintained the fire through the night with careful attention to our fuel consumption. In a storm of this magnitude, going outside to gather additional wood was impossible. Whatever fuel we had inside would have to last until conditions improved. This was why experienced mountain men always maintained wood supplies that exceeded their calculated needs by significant margins. What seemed like excessive preparation during mild weather became the difference between life and death when extreme conditions arrived. The psychological challenge of the storm was as significant as the physical one. The constant noise made sleep difficult, while the awareness of our complete isolation, no possibility of rescue or retreat if something went wrong, required mental discipline to avoid panic. I practiced the breathing techniques Sam had taught me, slow and deliberate respirations that helped maintain calm in stressful situations. I also engaged in the mental exercises that mountain men used to pass time during extended periods of forced inactivity. I mentally reviewed every aspect of our shelter's construction, visualizing each joint, each seal, each structural element that stood between us and the killing cold outside. This wasn't idle worry, but productive thinking that helped me understand our situation completely and identify any potential weak points that might need attention when the storm passed. Chapter 31. The Long Night of Testing. As the hours passed and the storm showed no signs of weakening, I began to understand why this winter was developing a reputation among the mountain men as one of the worst in memory. The temperatures were lower than usual, the storms more frequent and severe, and the periods between storms shorter than normal. These conditions tested every aspect of survival knowledge and preparation. I checked our food supplies again, calculating consumption rates against remaining stores. We had enough for another 2 weeks if the storm prevented hunting and trapping activities. Water wasn't a concern. We had abundant snow available, though melting it required precious fuel. The real question was whether our firewood would last through an extended period of severe weather. The storm had another effect that I hadn't fully anticipated. It made me acutely aware of my dependence on the knowledge that Sam had passed on to me. Every technique I used, every decision I made, every system that kept me alive had been learned from him, and the other mountain men who'd shared their hard-won wisdom. This knowledge wasn't theoretical. It was practical information that had been tested repeatedly in exactly these conditions. I thought about the network of mountain men scattered throughout the territory, each man alone in his own shelter but connected by shared knowledge and mutual concern. Tom Jenkins was somewhere perhaps 20 miles away, facing this same storm with his own shelter and supplies. Jim Morrison was even farther out, but using the same techniques, the same materials, the same understanding of how to survive when nature unleashed its full fury. This sense of connection across distance was psychologically important during extreme conditions. While I was physically alone, I wasn't truly isolated. I was part of a community of men who understood these challenges and supported each other through shared knowledge and occasional contact. The wisdom that kept me alive had been developed collectively, through the experiences of many men over many years. Speaking aloud served multiple purposes during the long hours of the storm. It exercised my voice after hours of silence, filled the shelter with human sound that competed with the wind's howling, and reinforced narratives of survival and competence that helped maintain psychological resilience. "Just wind and snow," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange after hours of silence. "Nothing we haven't handled before. Shelters sound, fires burning, supplies adequate. Storm will pass like they always do." These spoken affirmations weren't self-deception, but psychological tools for maintaining perspective during stressful conditions. By articulating the facts of our situation, we were safe, prepared, and competent. I reinforced cognitive patterns that supported effective decision-making rather than panic responses. Chapter 32: The Music of Solitude and the Deep Winter's Test. As darkness fell with the swiftness that only comes in high mountain country during winter, I lit a small oil lamp made from rendered animal fat with a carefully prepared juniper wick. The flickering light complemented our fire's glow, creating the warm ambience that fought against the psychological weight of early winter darkness, that crushing sense of isolation that could drive a man to despair if he let it. I checked my supplies with the methodical thoroughness that had become second nature after months in the wilderness. This daily accounting wasn't just practical necessity, but psychological technique, a way of asserting control in an environment where so much remained beyond human influence. Food supplies, enough for 3 more weeks at current consumption rates, assuming I could continue supplementing with trapped game. Firewood, enough for 4 days of continuous burning before I'd need to venture out again. Water, unlimited thanks to abundant snow, though melting it required precious fuel. Ammunition, adequate for hunting needs but not to be wasted. Tools and equipment, all in good condition, properly maintained and ready for use. This inventory process was calming, reassuring, a methodical review that confirmed I had what I needed to survive, at least for the immediate future. It was also a daily reminder of how precarious the balance really was, how quickly circumstances could change from manageable to desperate. Evening brought another ritual that had become crucial to my psychological survival: weather prediction. I stepped outside briefly despite the cold, to read the sky with eyes that had learned to interpret the mountain's atmospheric moods. The feel of the air, the direction and intensity of wind, the quality of starlight filtering through thin atmosphere. All these provided information about what the next day might bring. Low clouds were moving in from the west, visible as a darker mass against the star-filled sky. The wind was shifting, becoming more erratic. My shoulder wound was beginning to throb again, that reliable indicator that atmospheric pressure was dropping. All signs pointed to another storm approaching, probably arriving sometime tomorrow afternoon. This knowledge would influence every decision I made over the next day: when to gather firewood, whether to check distant traps, how much water to melt and store. Weather prediction wasn't casual interest for mountain men. It was survival intelligence that could mean the difference between being prepared and being caught fatally unprepared. Back inside, I added wood to the fire for the night, carefully banking the coals in the specific pattern Sam had taught me for maintaining slow, steady heat through the long hours of darkness. This ritual of fire management was both practical survival technique and psychological transition to the quieter evening hours. Mind needs rhythm, same as body, Sam had explained during my first winter under his tutelage. Morning rituals to start the day, evening rituals to end it properly. Keeps your thinking ordered when the world around you is chaos. From beneath my sleeping platform, I took out a small wooden flute, another psychological tool that was common among mountain men who understood the importance of mental health during extended isolation. Music provided emotional release, creative expression, and connection to cultural identity that helped maintain psychological resilience when human contact was impossible. I played a simple tune, one of several that Sam had taught me during long winter evenings, when the howling wind made conversation difficult. The notes filled our shelter, somehow making the small space seem larger, while simultaneously more intimate. The act of creating music, even simple melodies, stimulated parts of the brain that could grow dormant during isolation, helping maintain cognitive flexibility and emotional regulation. Man who can make music never truly alone, Sam had said when he first showed me how to carve a flute from a straight piece of pine. Got the whole world of sound for company, and sounds don't argue back or ask for your last piece of jerky. The music also served another purpose. It helped mask the sounds of wind and settling snow that could trigger anxiety in men who'd learned to associate unusual sounds with potential danger. During the quiet moments between songs, I could hear the wind picking up outside, confirming my prediction about approaching weather. Chapter 33. The final truth, when everything goes wrong. But what happened when all the preparation, all the knowledge, all the sophisticated engineering and psychological techniques weren't enough? What happened when the mountains threw something at you that exceeded every contingency plan and survival protocol? I'd heard the stories, whispered around campfires when the wind was down and the whiskey was flowing. Stories of men who'd done everything right and still died. Stories of shelters that had been built to withstand any storm but had been overwhelmed by conditions that exceeded all previous experience. Stories of psychological breaks that had occurred despite all the mental preparation and coping strategies. The winter of 1840 had been one such test, when temperatures dropped to levels that hadn't been recorded before or since, and storms lasted for weeks without break. Jeremiah Sullivan, one of the most experienced mountain men in the territory, had written about that winter in terms that still sent chills down my spine. The cold came like nothing I'd seen in 15 winters in these mountains. My thermometer, such as it was, showed 47 below for 12 straight days. The wind never stopped, not once, and it carried cold that went right through the best-built shelter like it was made of paper. Lost my partner Jake to it. Found him frozen in his bedroll 3 days after he'd stopped responding to my calls. Fire was still burning, shelter was tight as a drum, but the cold just reached in and took him anyway. Sullivan had survived that winter, barely, but he'd never been quite the same afterward. The experience had broken something in him that couldn't be repaired, some fundamental confidence in his ability to survive what the mountains might send. He'd lasted 2 more winters before hanging up his traps and heading back to civilization, one of the few mountain men who'd lived long enough to retire from the business. Those stories reminded me that for all our knowledge and preparation, we were still just human beings trying to survive in an environment that wasn't designed for human habitation. Every night that I fell asleep warm and dry was a small victory, but it was never guaranteed that I'd wake up the same way. The flute song complete, I set the instrument aside and prepared for sleep with the methodical care that characterized every aspect of mountain life. I checked the fire one final time, ensuring the coals were banked properly for slow burning through the night. I positioned my emergency fire starting kit within arm's reach of my sleeping platform, just in case the unthinkable happened and the fire died completely during the night. I arranged my clothing for the morning, laying out the layers I'd need in the order I'd put them on, thinking through the sequence of activities that would begin my next day of survival. Every detail mattered. Every small efficiency could make the difference between a good day and a difficult one. As I settled beneath the buffalo robes, I practiced the gratitude inventory that Sam had taught me as a defense against the negative thinking that could spiral into despair during long isolation. I mentally listed the positives in my current situation. A sound shelter that had proven its worth through multiple storms, adequate food supplies with successful trapping supplementing stored provisions, working tools maintained in good condition, physical health and strength, despite the harsh conditions, knowledge of survival techniques that had kept me alive through the most challenging months of my life. The list also included less tangible but equally important assets. Connections with other mountain men like Tom Jenkins, who provided both practical safety net and psychological comfort. Skills that allowed me to obtain what I needed from the environment around me. And perhaps most importantly, the mental resilience that had been developed through months of testing in conditions that would have broken lesser men. Man who counts his blessings finds more of them, Sam would say during the darkest days of winter, when despair seemed like the most rational response to our circumstances. Man who counts only troubles soon finds nothing else, and that's usually when the mountains claim another victim. This practice of conscious gratitude wasn't just positive thinking. It was cognitive training that reshaped perception from scarcity to adequacy, from victimhood to empowerment, from helplessness to competence. It was another tool in the psychological survival kit that had been developed by generations of men who'd faced these same challenges. Sleep approached now, my body tired from the day's physical activities, my mind calmed by the evening's rituals and psychological techniques that had been honed by generations of mountain men who'd faced these same challenges of isolation and winter survival. The fire popped softly, sending occasional sparks up the chimney where they disappeared into the darkness beyond our small circle of warmth and light. Outside, the wind was definitely picking up, confirming my weather prediction. By morning, we'd likely be in the grip of another storm, another test of our shelter's integrity and our survival system's effectiveness. But for tonight, wrapped in buffalo robes with the fire burning steadily, I'd accomplished the mountain man's daily victory, surviving another day in one of Earth's most hostile environments. Chapter 34. The Dawn of Understanding. The storm I'd predicted arrived with a vengeance sometime after midnight, announcing itself with wind that made our sturdy shelter creak and groan like a ship in heavy seas. I woke to the familiar sound of a mountain blizzard in full fury, wind shrieking around the corners of our shelter, snow driven at speeds that would strip flesh from bone in minutes, and the peculiar silence that comes between wind gusts when the air itself seems to be holding its breath. But I woke warm and dry, protected by systems that had been designed and built by men who understood what it meant to face winter in the high country. The fire had burned low during the night but hadn't died, the thermal mass of our stone fireplace releasing stored heat that had kept the interior temperature just above freezing. My buffalo robes had trapped my body heat efficiently, creating a microclimate of warmth despite the deadly conditions mere feet away. This contrast between the killing cold outside and the livable conditions inside our shelter represented the cumulative wisdom of generations of mountain men who'd learned through trial and error, success and failure, survival and death. Every technique we'd employed, every design principle we'd followed, every material we'd selected had been tested in the crucible of mountain winters and refined through the harsh experience of men whose lives depended on getting it right. As I lay there listening to the storm and feeling grateful for the warmth that surrounded me, I thought about the broader implications of what the mountain men had accomplished. They'd created sophisticated survival systems using only the materials that nature provided and the knowledge that hard experience had taught them. They'd solved complex engineering problems without formal education, developed psychological survival techniques without understanding the science behind them, and created social networks that provided mutual support in a wilderness where cooperation could mean the difference between life and death. The mountain men who survived decades in the Rockies understood that shelter construction was both science and art, requiring technical knowledge of engineering and material science combined with intuitive understanding of how natural systems work together to create protection from Earth's deadliest weather. But they also understood that shelter of the mind was equally important. The psychological techniques and perspectives that protected mental health during extreme isolation and stress, physical survival and psychological resilience were inseparable components of the mountain man's existence. Two sides of the same coin that couldn't be separated without ensuring failure. A man might have the finest shelter ever built, but if he lost his mind to isolation and despair, he'd be just as dead as if he'd never built any shelter at all. As consciousness gradually returned to full awareness, I remembered Sam's words from long ago, spoken during one of those philosophical moments that sometimes occurred during the quiet hours of a long winter evening. Mountains will test everything you are, body, mind, and spirit. Pass those tests and you'll find freedom like nothing else on earth. Fail them and you'll find a grave that nobody will ever visit. Those words had proven prophetic over the months I'd spent in the high country. The mountains had indeed tested everything I was, pushing me to limits I hadn't known existed, teaching me capabilities I hadn't realized I possessed, and showing me depths of resilience that could only be discovered through extreme challenge. Tomorrow would bring new tests, as every day in the mountains brought new challenges that required constant vigilance, continuous adaptation, and unwavering determination. But for now, secure in both shelter and mind, I could rest in the knowledge that I'd passed today's tests and earned the right to see another sunrise. Epilogue, the lasting legacy of the mountain men. Dawn broke with the soft pink and gold light that exists only in high mountain country after a major storm. The blizzard I'd predicted had indeed arrived and departed during the night, leaving behind a landscape transformed by fresh snow that glittered like diamonds in the early morning sun. My shelter had kept me warm and protected through the night, its systems working exactly as designed by men who'd understood the principles of survival in the extreme environments. I rose and tended to the fire first, as always. The routine of mountain life that centered around maintaining the heat source that stood between life and death. The fire caught quickly from the carefully banked coals, flames rising to push back the morning chill and restore the comfortable temperatures that made life not just possible, but bearable in this harsh environment. With fresh wood added and the fire crackling cheerfully, I began my morning routine with a sense of satisfaction that came from having survived another night in the wilderness. The storm had passed, leaving behind clear skies and brilliant sunshine that would make the day's tasks more pleasant, even as it reminded me of the beauty that existed alongside the danger in these magnificent mountains. Today marked my 80th day alone in the high country, a milestone that would have seemed impossible when I first arrived as a greenhorn fresh from Pennsylvania farmland. The isolation that had once seemed overwhelming had become familiar, almost comfortable, as daily rituals of survival created a rhythm that carried me forward through winter's heart. But this experience had taught me far more than just how to survive in extreme conditions. It had taught me about human resilience, about the capacity we all possess to adapt and thrive, even in circumstances that seem impossibly challenging. It had shown me the value of traditional knowledge passed down through generations of experience, and the importance of community even in the most isolated circumstances. The mountain men of the 1800s and 1840s weren't just tough guys who happened to be good at surviving in the wilderness. They were sophisticated engineers who developed complex systems for maintaining life in hostile environments. They were psychologists who understood how to maintain mental health during extreme isolation. They were teachers who passed on knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. And they were philosophers who understood something fundamental about the relationship between human beings and the natural world. Their legacy extends far beyond the specific techniques of wilderness survival. They demonstrated principles that remain relevant in any challenging environment: the importance of preparation and planning, the value of understanding natural systems, the necessity of maintaining both physical and mental health, and the power of human cooperation in overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles. As I prepared a simple breakfast of jerky and pine needle tea, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The months of learning from Sam, the gradual development of skills and knowledge that had seemed impossible to master, the testing of those skills against increasingly difficult challenges, and finally the confidence that came from knowing I could survive on my own in one of Earth's most hostile environments. The knowledge I'd gained wasn't just about building shelters or maintaining fires or managing food supplies. It was about understanding my own capabilities, about recognizing the difference between real danger and imagined threats, about finding sources of strength and resilience that I hadn't known existed. It was about learning to live deliberately, purposefully, with full awareness of the consequences of every decision and action. This kind of education couldn't be obtained from books or classrooms. It could only be earned through direct experience, through testing oneself against real challenges with real consequences. The mountain men understood this, which is why their knowledge was so practical, so immediately applicable, so effective at keeping people alive in conditions that would kill the unprepared. As the morning progressed and I went about the familiar tasks of maintaining my shelter and checking my supplies, I thought about the broader lessons that the mountain man experience offered to anyone facing difficult challenges in their own life. The principles of preparation, adaptation, persistence, and mutual support weren't limited to wilderness survival. They applied to any situation where success required overcoming significant obstacles. The mountain men's approach to problem solving was particularly relevant. They observed carefully, learned from others' experiences, tested solutions thoroughly, and adapted constantly as conditions changed. They didn't rely on theoretical knowledge, but instead built their understanding through practical experience and empirical observation. Perhaps most importantly, they understood that survival, whether in the wilderness or in any challenging environment, required integration of physical preparation, mental resilience, technical knowledge, and social cooperation. No single element was sufficient. Success required mastering all aspects of the survival equation. As afternoon faded toward evening and I completed another day of mountain life, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the knowledge that had been passed down to me by men like Sam Mackenzie. Their wisdom, earned through generations of harsh experience, had kept me alive through conditions that would have killed me without it. But I also felt a responsibility to preserve and pass on that wisdom, to ensure that future generations would have access to the knowledge and principles that had enabled human beings to survive and thrive in even the most challenging environments. The mountain men's legacy wasn't just their specific techniques, but their approach to learning, their methods of problem solving, and their understanding of what it meant to live with purpose and determination in the face of extreme challenges. Final reflection, the enduring wisdom. As I settled into my sleeping platform for another night, surrounded by the warmth and security that sophisticated survival systems provided, I reflected on the extraordinary achievement that the mountain men represented. They had taken human beings, creatures poorly adapted for extreme cold and high altitude, and enabled them not just to survive but to thrive in conditions that would challenge modern technology. They had done this without access to synthetic materials, without power tools, without weather forecasting, without GPS navigation, without emergency communications, without any of the technological supports that we now consider essential for wilderness survival. They had relied instead on knowledge, skill, preparation, and the kind of mental toughness that could only be developed through direct experience with extreme challenges. Their shelters weren't just structures, but expressions of a relationship with the environment, working with natural principles rather than against them, using local materials in ways that maximized their inherent properties, creating systems that were elegant in their efficiency and profound in their effectiveness. As veteran mountain man Jeremiah Collins wrote in 1887, reflecting on his decades in the Rockies, "A man's shelter is his life in the mountains. Build it right, and it will keep you warm through the worst storms nature can send. Build it wrong, and it becomes your tomb." The simplicity of that statement belies the depth of knowledge behind it. The understanding represented by that knowledge of site selection, structural engineering, thermal dynamics, weatherproofing, emergency protocols, all integrated into comprehensive systems for maintaining life in conditions that actively threatened it, represents one of humanity's most impressive achievements in the field of survival technology. My consciousness continued to fade as sleep approached more strongly now. The fire popped softly, a comforting sound that had accompanied human sleep for countless generations. The buffalo robes held my body's heat close, creating a microclimate of warmth, despite the sub-zero temperatures that existed just beyond our walls. In this moment, suspended between wakefulness and sleep, there was a profound connection between past and present, between the mountain men of the 1800s and me now, using the same principles, the same materials, the same techniques to survive the same unforgiving environment. That continuity across time spoke to something essential about human adaptation and resilience. The specific challenges might change from one generation to the next, but the core requirements for survival remained constant: shelter, heat, water, food, and the knowledge to secure them in whatever environment we found ourselves. The mountain men had mastered these fundamentals in their extreme form, creating a legacy of knowledge and technique that remained relevant far beyond their specific historical context. Sleep deepened, my breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the fire's gentle crackling. My last conscious thoughts were of gratitude for the knowledge passed down that kept me alive night after night, for the shelter that stood between me and the killing cold, for the skills that allowed me to maintain that shelter through the worst weather the mountains could deliver. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I'd accomplished the mountain man's fundamental victory, surviving another day in one of Earth's most hostile environments through knowledge, preparation, and respect for the forces of nature. And in that achievement there was a deep satisfaction that came from knowing I'd been tested by the mountains and found adequate to the challenge. As I slept, the snow began to fall again outside, soft flakes drifting down in the darkness. Inside, the temperature remained stable, the shelter systems working as designed to maintain the bubble of habitability that made survival possible. This was the ultimate legacy of the mountain men, not just techniques for surviving winter, but comprehensive systems for creating and maintaining life-sustaining conditions in environments that would otherwise prove fatal. Their knowledge, earned through generations of harsh experience, remained relevant even in our modern world, so removed from the direct survival challenges they faced. And now, as you rest comfortably in your own bed, far from the harsh mountain winter, perhaps there's something valuable in remembering these pioneers of survival, their resourcefulness, their self-reliance, their intimate understanding of natural systems. The mountain men's shelters were more than just protection from the elements. They were expressions of human ingenuity, adaptability, and resilience in the face of extreme challenges. They stand as testaments to our capacity to survive and even thrive in conditions that seem impossibly hostile, reminding us that the same human ingenuity that allowed them to survive Rocky Mountain winters continues to find solutions to whatever challenges we face today. Sleep well, knowing that you carry within you the same capacity for resilience that allowed these remarkable men to face the deadliest blizzards and emerge with stories to tell, stories that, like this one, eventually find their way to peaceful sleep, carrying forward the enduring wisdom of those who danced with death in the frozen wilderness and lived to pass on their knowledge to future generations. The mountain men understood something profound about the relationship between human beings and the natural world. They recognized that we are not separate from nature but part of it, and that our survival depends not on conquering the environment but on learning to work with its forces and rhythms. This understanding informed every aspect of their approach to wilderness living, from the way they selected building sites to the materials they chose for construction, to the psychological techniques they used to maintain mental health during extreme isolation. Their legacy reminds us that human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of thriving in environments that seem impossibly hostile when we combine knowledge, skill, preparation, and mental toughness. The same qualities that allowed them to survive Rocky Mountain winters: careful observation, practical knowledge, psychological resilience, and mutual cooperation remain relevant for overcoming challenges in any environment. As the fire burns low and consciousness fades into the peaceful sleep that comes from a day well lived and challenges successfully met, their story continues to inspire anyone who faces difficult circumstances with determination, wisdom, and respect for the forces beyond our control. In that spirit, their memory lives on, keeping warm the flame of human resilience that burns as steady as any mountain man's fire through the darkest and coldest nights of the soul. The snow continues to fall gently outside, each flake a reminder of nature's power and beauty, while inside the shelter holds strong against winter's test, a testament to human ingenuity and the enduring wisdom of those who came before. And in that balance between human knowledge and natural force, the true legacy of the mountain men lives on, not just in techniques for survival, but in understanding what it means to live with courage, preparation, and respect for the magnificent and dangerous world we inhabit. The mountains keep their secrets well, but to those who approach them with proper knowledge, adequate preparation, and deep respect, they occasionally reveal their ancient wisdom about what it truly means to be alive, fully present, and deeply connected to the forces that shape our world. In that revelation lies the true treasure that the mountain men discovered, not gold or furs, but the profound satisfaction that comes from meeting life's ultimate challenges with skill, courage, and unwavering determination. This understanding transcends the specifics of wilderness survival and speaks to fundamental truths about human nature and our relationship with the world around us. The mountain men's legacy teaches us that we are capable of far more than we often believe possible, that knowledge passed down through generations carries within it the accumulated wisdom of countless individuals who face similar challenges, and that the courage to test ourselves against difficult circumstances often reveals strengths we never knew we possessed. Their story reminds us that in our modern world of conveniences and technological supports, we sometimes forget the basic principles that have enabled human survival and flourishing for thousands of years. The mountain men's approach to problem solving, their understanding of preparation and planning, their recognition of the importance of community and mutual support, and their deep respect for natural forces remain as relevant today as they were in the remote wilderness of the 19th century American West. As this story draws to its close in the warm glow of firelight and the security of hard-won knowledge, their example continues to inspire anyone who faces uncertainty with determination, preparation, and faith in human resilience. The fire burns steady, the shelter stands strong, and the eternal dance between human ingenuity and natural force continues through each generation, carrying forward the timeless wisdom of those who dared to test themselves against the ultimate challenges and emerged not just as survivors, but as teachers whose lessons echo through the ages like the wind through mountain passes. In the end, that may be the greatest legacy of all, not just survival itself, but the knowledge that enables survival and the courage to face whatever challenges await with preparation, wisdom, and unshakable determination to see the next sunrise. No matter how dark the night may seem, or how fierce the winter storms that test our resolve and strengthen our spirit through adversity and hardship, that forge character and resilience in the crucible of extreme challenge and ultimate testing of human endurance, courage, determination, resourcefulness, adaptability, knowledge, preparation, skill, mental toughness, psychological resilience, and unwavering commitment to survival against all odds in the face of nature's most formidable and unforgiving challenges that have tested humanity since the beginning of time and will continue to test us as long as we dare to venture into the wild places where survival depends entirely on our wisdom, preparation, and strength of character developed through generations of hard-won experience passed down from those who came before us, and blazed the trail through darkness toward the light of knowledge and understanding that illuminates the path forward for all who follow in their footsteps with courage, determination, and respect for the eternal forces that shape our world and our destiny within it, creating a legacy that endures through time and inspires future generations to face their own challenges with the same spirit of adventure, preparation, and unshakable faith in human resilience that enabled the mountain men to thrive in the harshest environments on Earth and emerge victorious from their trials with stories to tell and wisdom to share with all who seek to understand what it truly means to live with purpose, courage, and determination in harmony with the natural world that surrounds us all. Chapter 14. The Mathematics of Survival. Fuel management systems ensured adequate fuel supplies during extended storms when fuel collection was impossible. Mountain men calculated fuel consumption rates for different weather conditions, established fuel storage systems that kept wood dry and accessible, and developed fuel preparation techniques that maximized heat output while minimizing fuel consumption during critical periods. My eyes drifted to our wood pile. I estimated enough for 3 days of continuous burning at current rates. If the storm lasted longer, I'd need to venture out, regardless of danger, to gather more. Always have 3 times the wood you think you'll need was one of Sam's most repeated lessons. Weather don't care about your plans. Mountain men typically stored enough seasoned wood to last through month-long storms, with emergency reserves for extended weather events. Running out of firewood mid-blizzard was a death sentence, plain and simple. Outside, wind howled again, finding some tiny gap in chinking between logs and sending a knife-like draft cutting through warm air. I made a mental note to find and seal that gap when there was more light. Heat retention techniques included insulation systems, air sealing methods, and thermal barriers that prevented heat loss, while maintaining adequate ventilation for safety and air quality. Wait, insulation? But I said earlier these shelters didn't have insulation as we know it today. That's true. They didn't have fiberglass or foam, but they absolutely had insulation. Chapter 15. Natural Insulation Mastery. Mountain men used natural insulation materials, including animal fur, dried grass, and clay chinking that created effective thermal barriers while allowing controlled air exchange, preventing carbon monoxide buildup. I ran my hand along the wall nearest our sleeping platform. Between logs, chinking wasn't just clay. It was a mixture of clay, dried grass, and in some spots, animal hair. All materials that trapped tiny air pockets, the same principle modern insulation uses. Tight walls make warm nights, Sam would say, carefully packing mixture of clay and grass between logs, but never too tight. A shelter that don't breathe will suffocate you silent in your sleep. They understood that proper insulation could reduce heating requirements by up to 70%, while maintaining comfortable living conditions. The difference between burning 1 cord of wood per week versus 3 or 4, which often meant the difference between survival and freezing. The fire burned perfectly now, radiating blessed heat throughout our shelter. I sat on the sleeping platform's edge, watching flames dance. Outside, the blizzard continued unabated, but in here we were warm, for now. Chapter 16. radiant heat and hot stones. What about when you needed to be away from the fire? Radiant heating systems used heated stones, metal objects, and thermal mass elements that could store heat during active burning periods and release radiant energy over extended periods. I noticed several smooth, round stones placed near our fire. These weren't random. Later, I'd heat these stones in the fire, wrap them in scraps of hide, and place them in my bedding before sleeping. Instant bed warmers that would radiate heat for hours. Mountain men heated stones in fires and placed them strategically throughout shelters to provide localized heating. They used metal objects as heat sinks that stored and released thermal energy, and designed sleeping areas that maximized radiant heat exposure while maintaining safety margins. A memory flashed through my mind, Sam teaching me how to survive if our fire went out completely. Heat rocks, he said, placing several fist-sized stones at fire's edge. If your fire dies and you can't get it going again, put these hot rocks in a circle around you. They'll keep you alive till morning. The fire snapped and popped as a sap pocket ignited in one of the logs. Dancing flames cast shifting shadows on walls. Despite the howling storm outside, there was surprising peacefulness here. Humans have gathered around fires for warmth and protection for hundreds of thousands of years. There's something primal and comforting about it. Morning would come eventually. The storm would pass. But for now our world had contracted to this small, warm space carved from deadly winter wilderness. Chapter 17, The Rhythm of Mountain Life. I added another log to the fire, watching flames curl around it. There's an art to fire maintenance. Not too much wood at once, or you'll smother it. Not too little, or it'll burn out too quickly. This was mountain life's rhythm. Constant vigilance. Knowledge that survival depended on 1,000 small decisions made correctly. I stretched my legs toward the fire, feeling heat seep into tired muscles. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Checking roof for snow load, inspecting walls for new drafts, possibly venturing out for more firewood if the storm broke. But for now I'd mastered the most crucial survival skill of the mountain man. Creating warmth in the face of killing cold. Another log shifted in the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. I thought about mountain men who came before me, who figured out these heating systems through brutal trial and error. How many froze to death before they learned proper chimney construction? How many suffocated from carbon monoxide before they understood ventilation importance? We stand on the frozen corpses of those who got it wrong, Sam would say grimly, whenever he taught a new survival technique. Not the most cheerful teaching method, but it drove the point home. Heat from the fire made me drowsy again. I banked the fire carefully, arranging logs in a specific pattern that would allow slow but steady burning for hours. Another skill learned through generations of life or death winters. Chapter 18, Dawn and the Leak. Soft light of dawn seeped through our single small window, a square opening covered with oiled animal bladder that let in light but kept out wind. I'd slept better than expected thanks to steady heat from the fireplace and buffalo robes, but something wasn't right. There was dampness in the air that shouldn't be there. I sat up, instantly alert. Dampness in a mountain shelter during winter isn't just uncomfortable, it's deadly. Where there's dampness, there's a breach in weatherproofing. Where there's a breach, killing cold can follow. A water drop landed on my hand. I looked up. The ceiling showed a wet spot, small but growing. Snow on the roof was melting from our fire's heat, finding some tiny gap and seeping through. If left unchecked, it would soak our bedding, our clothes, and eventually us. In sub-zero temperatures, wet meant dead. The Henderson family learned this the hard way during their first Rocky Mountain winter of 1842, when ice formed inside their poorly sealed cabin near what's now Colorado Springs. Despite maintaining a constant fire, they nearly died from hypothermia. The father, Jonathan Henderson, described it in his journal. "We burned every stick of wood we had, and still the cold penetrated like a knife. Moisture from our breath froze on inside walls. We huddled together, shivering, watching ice form on our blankets." 3 years later, that same family's shelter remained completely dry and comfortable, even during the worst blizzards. What changed? They mastered the science of weatherproofing. Chapter 19, The Science of Staying Dry. I swung my legs over the sleeping platform's edge and grabbed a buckskin shirt, pulling it over my head. The fire needed tending first. Survival priority 1. But that leak would need fixing before it worsened. Creating weatherproof barriers that could exclude wind, moisture, and cold, while maintaining structural integrity, required sophisticated understanding of material science and environmental protection systems. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. I stoked the fire, adding more wood. Flames rose, pushing back morning chill. Now for that leak. I grabbed a small wooden ladder leaning against one wall and positioned it under the damp spot. Climbing up, I could see the problem. A small section of roof covering had worked loose, allowing melting snow to seep through. Wall construction and chinking systems created weatherproof barriers that excluded wind and moisture while maintaining structural strength. Mountain men used log construction techniques that created tight-fitting joints, chinking materials that sealed gaps without compromising structural flexibility, and weatherproofing treatments that protected wood from moisture damage while maintaining breathability that prevented condensation problems. "You know what kills most greenhorns their first winter?" Sam asked me once. "Not cold, not Indians, not even wolves. It's the gaps between their logs, tiny little spaces they never noticed in summer that turn into deadly wind tunnels come January." Chapter 20. The Architecture of Weather Resistance. I reached up and touched the wet spot. Water was cold against my fingers. Outside, the blizzard had calmed somewhat, but snow still fell heavily. Temperature might be around 10 below zero, warm by Rocky Mountain winter standards. Looking at roof construction from inside, I could appreciate the care that went into it. Split logs overlapping like shingles, with moss and clay packed between them for insulation and waterproofing. Normally it would shed water and snow perfectly, but something had shifted. Log preparation and fitting techniques created tight joints that minimized air infiltration and heat loss. Mountain men selected logs with consistent diameters, shaped joining surfaces using hand tools that created precise fits, and used traditional joinery methods that created interlocking connections capable of withstanding structural movement during temperature cycling. I remembered helping build this shelter last summer, the care taken in selecting each log, stripping bark, shaping joints. Nothing was random. "See how these logs fit together?" Sam demonstrated, showing me how to notch the ends. "That ain't just for looks. Each log sits tight against the one below it. Less gaps means less chinking. Less chinking means fewer leaks." He was right. Proper log fitting could reduce air infiltration by up to 80% while maintaining structural integrity under extreme loading conditions. Every percent mattered when temperature dropped to 40 below. Chapter 21. The Materials of Survival. I climbed down the ladder and moved it aside. I'd need to go outside to fix the roof properly, but first I needed the right materials. From a corner of our shelter, I gathered pre-made chinking, a mixture of clay, grass and animal hair that had been soaking in a wooden bucket to keep it pliable. Chinking materials and application methods sealed gaps between logs, using natural materials that provided weatherproofing while allowing controlled thermal movement. Mountain men used clay-based chinking compounds, mixed with organic fibers that created flexible seals, applied chinking in multiple layers that provided redundant weatherproofing, and maintained chinking systems through regular inspection and repair that ensured continued effectiveness. Good chinking's like good stitching, Sam told me once, watching me repair a seam in my buckskin shirt. Too loose, stuff gets through. Too tight, it tears when stretched. Got to be just right. They knew that proper chinking was essential for maintaining interior temperatures and preventing moisture infiltration. A well-chinked wall could mean the difference between a comfortable winter and a fatal one. I pulled on my heaviest coat, wrapped a woolen scarf around my face, and put on thick mittens. Going outside in a blizzard, even briefly, required proper protection. I grabbed a wooden shovel and small bag of repair materials. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. A thick wooden slab hung on leather hinges. Instantly, a blast of cold air rushed in along with a swirl of snow. I stepped outside quickly, pulling the door shut behind me. Chapter 22. Facing the Elements. The cold was shocking. A physical force that seemed to knock breath from my lungs. Even through my layers, I could feel it searching for any gap, any weakness. This was the cold that killed, that froze flesh solid in minutes. Snow had drifted nearly to the roof on our shelter's windward side, creating a natural insulation barrier. On the leeward side, where I needed to work, snow was only about 3 feet deep. I waded through it, circling to the shelter's back. Roof systems were designed to shed snow and water, while providing adequate insulation and structural strength to withstand extreme loading conditions. Mountain men built roofs using steep angles that promoted snow shedding, waterproof barriers that prevented moisture infiltration, and insulation systems that prevented heat loss, while avoiding ice dam formation that could cause structural damage. Looking up, I could see the problem. A small section of roof covering had been lifted by wind, creating a gap where melting snow could seep through. It wasn't a major breach yet, but left unattended, it could grow worse. I used the shovel to clear snow from the shelter's base, creating a stable platform for my ladder. Then I climbed up, my fingers already stiffening in bitter cold despite mittens. Roof construction techniques used overlapping materials that created multiple waterproof barriers while maintaining structural strength under snow loading. Mountain men used split shingles, bark sheets, and hide coverings that created layered waterproofing systems, incorporated proper drainage that prevented water accumulation, and designed roof structures that could support maximum expected snow loads while maintaining weatherproof integrity. Chapter 23. The Urgency of Repair. The repair was straightforward but had to be done quickly before cold became dangerous. I pressed the loose section back into place, then applied fresh chinking around edges to seal it. Clay mixture was already starting to stiffen in the cold, but I worked quickly, hands moving with practiced efficiency. 3 minutes, Sam's voice echoed in my head. That's how long you got to work bare-handed in this cold before your fingers stop working. Count it out, plan your moves, get back inside before your hands become useless clubs. I was working with mittens, which helped, but still the cold was penetrating. I finished the repair, packed up materials and hurried back inside, my face stinging from just those few minutes of exposure. Back in our shelter, warmth wrapped around me like an embrace. I hung my snow-covered coat near the fire to dry and warmed my hands, careful not to get them too close to flames. Rapid temperature change from extreme cold to heat could be almost as painful as the cold itself. I checked the ceiling. The wet spot had stopped growing, which meant my repair was holding. Given a day or two, the dampness would dry out completely thanks to heat from our fire. This small incident highlighted the constant vigilance required for mountain survival. Even a tiny breach in weatherproofing could spiral into a life-threatening situation within hours. Chapter 24: The Balance of Air and Warmth. Moisture management systems prevented condensation, ice formation, and humidity problems that could create dangerous living conditions and compromise structural integrity. Mountain men understood that moisture control required balancing ventilation needs with heat retention requirements while preventing condensation that could freeze and create dangerous ice accumulation inside living spaces. "Wet kills you 3 ways," Sam explained during my first winter. "It steals your body heat, it ruins your gear, and it rots your shelter from the inside out." He wasn't exaggerating. A wet shelter could quickly become uninhabitable in winter, leaving you exposed to elements. Death would follow shortly. I moved around our shelter's interior, checking for other signs of moisture or drafts. Near one corner I felt slight air movement, another small gap in chinking that needed repair. I gathered some chinking mixture and pressed it into the gap, smoothing it with my fingers. Ventilation systems provided fresh air and prevented carbon monoxide poisoning while minimizing heat loss during extreme cold conditions. Mountain men designed ventilation systems that created controlled air exchange, prevented dangerous gas accumulation, and maintained air quality without compromising heating efficiency or creating uncomfortable drafts that increased heat loss. "A shelter that don't breathe will kill you quiet in your sleep," Sam warned. "But too much breathing lets all your heat escape. Got to find the balance." Mountain men used adjustable ventilation openings that could be modified based on weather conditions and heating requirements. A small flap near our roof's peak could be opened or closed to control airflow and prevent buildup of deadly carbon monoxide from the fire. Chapter 25: The Wolf's Warning. I checked this ventilation flap, making sure it was adjusted properly, open enough to allow smoke and gases to escape, but not so open that it wasted heat. Like everything in mountain life, it was a careful balance. The repair work had made me hungry. From a leather pouch hanging on the wall, I took some strips of dried venison. Jerky tough enough to make your jaw ache, but packed with protein and fat needed to maintain body heat in this climate. As I chewed, I thought about our shelter's door. Door and window systems created secure closures that excluded weather while providing access and natural lighting when conditions permitted. Mountain men built door systems using multiple barriers, weather sealing techniques, and emergency closure methods that could maintain weatherproof seals even during extreme wind and temperature conditions. Our door was a solid piece of split log hung on leather hinges and secured with a wooden latch. Around its edges, strips of fur created a seal that blocked drafts. When closed, it fit so snugly that even the fiercest wind couldn't find a way through. "A door ain't just a hole with a cover," Sam lectured when teaching me shelter construction. "It's a weak point that needs reinforcing. Make it solid as a wall, but able to open when needed." Mountain men used thick wooden doors with multiple sealing layers, created airlocks that prevented heat loss during entry and exit, and designed emergency closure systems that could seal openings during extreme weather events. The day passed in a rhythm of maintenance tasks and fireplace tending. By late afternoon, the storm had weakened considerably. Through our window, I could see patches of clear sky appearing between clouds. The worst had passed, at least for now. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, digging out from fresh snow, assessing any damage to our shelter's exterior, gathering more firewood before the next storm hit. But for today, our weatherproofing had held. Chapter 26, The Silent Killer. Morning came with brilliant sunshine reflecting off snow, flooding our shelter with light through the small window. The fire had burned low overnight, but not out, a testament to my careful banking of coals before sleep. Temperature inside hovered just above freezing, cold enough to see your breath, but not cold enough to be dangerous. I rose and tended to the fire first, as always. The routine of mountain life centered around this essential task, maintaining the heat source that stood between us and death. With fresh wood added and flames crackling, I began my morning routine. A week had passed since the major blizzard. I'd maintained our shelter, gathered sufficient firewood, and tended to necessary repairs. But mountain life was never truly secure. New challenges emerged constantly, and today brought one I'd been anticipating. The loneliness was starting to wear on me. Most people don't realize that physical survival was only part of the mountain man's challenge. Psychological survival techniques addressed mental health challenges during extended isolation and extreme stress that could compromise decision-making and survival effectiveness. I sat by the fire, sipping bitter tea made from pine needles, not tasty but rich in vitamin C that prevents scurvy during winter months when fresh food is scarce. Through our window I could see the vastness of mountain landscape stretching to the horizon. Beautiful, but also isolating. I hadn't seen another human face in nearly 2 months. Sam called it the winter madness. Seen good men crack like thin ice, he told me during my first mountain winter. Mind starts playing tricks, starts talking to themselves, then answering back, different voice for each. Had a partner once who ended up arguing with himself so fierce he couldn't tend to survival needs. Found him frozen come spring thaw, surrounded by plenty of firewood he never bothered to burn. Chapter 27, The Architecture of the Mind. Mountain men understood psychological survival methods that maintained morale, prevented panic, and sustained rational decision-making during extended survival situations that tested mental as well as physical endurance. They developed mental exercises, activity routines, and psychological techniques that could maintain mental health during months of isolation and extreme stress. I reached for my journal, a handmade book of paper pages bound with rawhide. Writing was one such mental exercise. Not all mountain men were literate, but those who were often kept detailed journals, not just for practical record-keeping, but as a way to externalize thoughts, maintain a sense of purpose, and create dialogue where no conversation partners were available. I recorded the date, weather conditions, and recent activities. Then I wrote more personal reflections, memories of home, plans for spring, observations about changing light as winter progressed. The act of writing focused my mind, preventing aimless wandering of thoughts that can lead to despair. Keep your hands busy and your mind will follow, Sam advised. Idle hands make for crazy thoughts in winter isolation, so I followed his advice. After writing, I moved on to carving, another common mountain man pastime that served both practical and psychological purposes. From a piece of pine, I was fashioning a new handle for my skinning knife. The work required concentration, keeping my mind engaged on immediate tasks rather than dwelling on isolation or dangers outside. Chapter 28, The Network of Survival. The psychological toll of mountain winters was rarely discussed openly among the men. Showing mental weakness was as taboo as showing physical weakness. But the old-timers found ways to teach coping strategies to those who would listen. Sam's teachings came back to me as I worked. Set daily goals, no matter how small. Maintain routines. Talk out loud sometimes, even to yourself, just to hear a human voice. Find beauty in small things. Remember that spring always comes eventually. These weren't just folksy sayings, but sophisticated psychological techniques developed through generations of trial and error in extreme isolation. The mountain men who survived multiple winters were those who mastered not just physical survival, but mental resilience. The carving complete, I set aside the new knife handle to dry and cure. Next, I checked my traps, another daily routine that provided both practical benefits and psychological structure. I had 3 set within 100 yards of our shelter, positioned to catch snowshoe hares that might venture out after the storm. Bundling up against the cold, I stepped outside. Temperature had risen somewhat with the sun, perhaps to around 0 degrees, almost balmy by winter mountain standards. Snow crunched beneath my snowshoes as I made my rounds. The first trap was empty, so was the second. But the third held a prize, a fat snowshoe hare, its white winter coat blending almost perfectly with snow. Fresh meat was a luxury in winter, both nutritionally and psychologically. The successful hunt lifted my spirits immediately. Chapter 29, The Communication Lifeline. Back in our shelter, I skinned and cleaned the hare with practiced efficiency. Nothing was wasted. Meat would be food. Fur would be saved for mittens or hat lining. Even bones would be used for tools or boiled for broth. Mountain life demanded complete utilization of every resource. As I worked, my thoughts turned to another aspect of winter survival rarely discussed in romantic tales of mountain men: the need for human connection. Communication and rescue protocols provided methods for summoning help and coordinating rescue efforts when emergencies exceeded individual survival capabilities. Mountain men established communication systems, emergency signaling methods, and mutual aid agreements that could coordinate assistance during life-threatening emergencies that required outside help. I thought about Tom Jenkins, whose cabin lay about 15 miles to the east. Before winter set in, Tom and I established a simple communication system. A column of smoke from a specific ridgetop would signal an emergency requiring assistance. If either of us saw the signal, we'd come with supplies and help. Such informal networks were common among mountain men despite their reputation for rugged individualism. They understood that some situations exceeded one person's capacity to handle alone. A broken leg, severe illness, or major shelter damage might require outside help to survive. Mountain man who thinks he needs nobody is usually the first to die, Sam told me bluntly. Pride makes for shallow graves out here. So far this winter, I hadn't needed to signal Tom, nor had I seen a signal from him. But the knowledge that the system existed provided psychological comfort beyond its practical value. Chapter 30. Emergency Protocols in the Wilderness. I set the hare meat to cook in a stew pot over the fire, adding dried berries and pine nuts gathered last fall. Rich aroma filled our small shelter, another psychological boost that countered the monotony of winter rations. While the stew simmered, I took out my map, a hand-drawn representation of the surrounding 50 miles showing water sources, good hunting grounds, locations of other trappers' cabins, and potential danger areas like avalanche slopes. I studied it daily, another mental exercise that maintained spatial awareness and reinforced my connection to the larger landscape beyond immediate surroundings. On the map, I'd marked several rendezvous points where scattered mountain men agreed to meet in case of emergencies, or when spring allowed easier travel. These locations were carefully chosen for accessibility from multiple directions and natural resources that could support a group temporarily. The annual rendezvous was a larger-scale version of this system, a gathering of mountain men, Native Americans, and supply caravans that provided not just trade opportunities, but crucial social connection that sustained mental health through isolation of winter months. They were wild affairs with trading, competitions, storytelling, and plenty of whiskey when available. But the smaller, emergency-focused meeting points were equally important for survival. They created a safety net in a wilderness where official rescue systems didn't exist. Always know where to find help and how to reach it, Sam instructed, and always be ready to provide it when others need. Mountains don't care about debts, but mountain men do. Chapter 31, The Rituals of Resilience. The stew was ready. I ladled some into a wooden bowl and ate slowly, savouring rich flavour of fresh meat after weeks of jerky and pemmican. Good food was another psychological boost, a reminder that even at winter's depths, small pleasures remained available. After eating, I cleaned my bowl with snow brought in earlier, then returned to my journal. Now I recorded information about the successful trap, preparation of the hare, and condition of surrounding area as observed during my brief excursion. These practical notes might seem mundane, but they served as both future reference and as a way to mark time's passage. Another psychological technique for managing long isolation. As afternoon faded toward evening, I began my daily story cycle. Mountain men often memorized dozens of stories, poems, and songs that they would recite to themselves during winter isolation. Some kept books when available, reading the same text repeatedly as both entertainment and mental exercise. I recited aloud a story Sam taught me, the tale of Hugh Glass, who survived a grizzly attack and crawled over 100 miles with terrible injuries to reach safety. The story's theme of resilience against overwhelming odds resonated at the winter wilderness. Speaking aloud served multiple purposes. It exercised my voice after days of silence, filled the shelter with human sound, and reinforced narratives of survival against hardship that helped maintain psychological resilience. Chapter 32, The Music of Solitude. As darkness fell, I lit a small oil lamp made from animal fat with a juniper wick. Flickering light complemented our fire's glow, creating warm ambience that fought against the psychological weight of early winter darkness. I checked my supplies, another daily routine that served both practical and psychological purposes. Knowing exactly what resources I had available provided security and allowed for effective planning. I had enough food for 3 more weeks at current consumption rates, enough firewood for 4 days before I'd need to gather more. Water was unlimited thanks to abundant snow. Our shelter remained sound, repairs from after the blizzard holding well. This accounting of resources was calming, a way of asserting control in an environment where so much remained beyond human influence. Evening brought another ritual, weather prediction. I stepped outside briefly, reading the sky, feeling the air, noting behavior of the few animals active in winter. Low clouds moving in from the west suggested another storm might be approaching, though likely not as severe as the last blizzard. I'd need to prepare nevertheless, perhaps gathering additional firewood tomorrow if conditions allowed. Back inside, I added wood to the fire for the night. The ritual of banking coals for slow burning through darkness was both practical survival and psychological transition to quieter evening hours. Mind needs rhythm, same as body, Sam explained. Morning rituals to start the day, evening rituals to end it. Keeps your thinking ordered when the world around you is chaos. From beneath my sleeping platform, I took out a small wooden flute. another psychological tool common among mountain men. Music provided emotional release, creative expression, and connection to cultural identity that helped maintain mental resilience during isolation. Chapter 33, The Final Truth. I played a simple tune, one Sam taught me during my first winter together. Notes filled our shelter, somehow making the space seem larger while simultaneously more intimate. The act of creating music, even simple melodies, stimulated parts of the brain that could grow dormant during isolation, helping maintain cognitive flexibility and emotional regulation. Man who can make music never truly alone, Sam said when he first showed me how to carve a flute. Got the whole world of sound for company. The tune complete, I set the flute aside and prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, weather to predict, firewood to gather, traps to check, maintenance to perform. The cycle of survival continued without pause. As I settled beneath buffalo robes, I practiced another psychological technique Sam taught: gratitude inventory. I mentally listed positives in my current situation: a sound shelter, adequate food, working tools, health and strength, knowledge of survival techniques, connections with other mountain men like Tom, skills to obtain what I needed from the environment. This practice counteracted the tendency toward negative focus that isolation could exacerbate. By consciously identifying elements to be grateful for, I reshaped my perception from deprivation to sufficiency. Man who counts his blessings finds more of them, Sam would say. Man who counts only troubles soon finds nothing else. Sleep approached now, my body tired from the day's activities, my mind calmed by evening rituals and psychological techniques honed by generations of mountain men who faced these same challenges of isolation and winter survival. The fire popped softly. Outside, wind began to rise slightly, perhaps bringing the storm I predicted earlier. But inside our shelter, protected by physical systems and fortified by psychological resilience, I drifted towards sleep. Another day of mountain winter survival complete. Epilogue. The lasting legacy. The mountain men who survived decades in the Rockies understood that shelter construction was both science and art. Requiring technical knowledge of engineering and material science, combined with intuitive understanding of how natural systems work together to create protection from Earth's deadliest weather. But they also understood that shelter of the mind was equally important. The psychological techniques and perspectives that protected mental health during extreme isolation and stress. Physical survival and psychological resilience were inseparable components of the mountain man's existence. As consciousness faded, I remembered Sam's words from long ago. Mountains will test everything you are, body, mind, and spirit. Pass those tests and you'll find freedom like nothing else on earth. Tomorrow would bring new tests, but for now, secure in shelter and mind, I slept. Dawn broke with the soft pink and gold light that exists only in high mountain country. The storm I predicted had arrived overnight but proved milder than expected. Just enough new snow to freshen the landscape without creating dangerous conditions. My shelter had kept me warm and protected through the night, its systems working exactly as designed. I rose and tended to the fire, adding wood from the carefully stacked pile beside the hearth. Morning light filtered through the small window, catching dust motes dancing in the air. The routine of mountain life continued. Predictable, necessary, grounding. As I prepared a simple breakfast of jerky and pine needle tea, my thoughts drifted to the journey that brought me here. What compelled men to leave relative comfort and safety for this harsh existence? For some, it was the promise of beaver pelts and fortune they could bring. For others, freedom from society's constraints. For many, including myself, it was something less definable, a calling to test oneself against raw elements, to live by wits and skill in a place that forgave no mistakes. Most folks never understand why we do it, Sam told me once, gazing out over a mountain valley in summer. They think it's about running from something. Maybe for some it is, but for the real mountain men, it's about running to something, to a life that's hard but honest, where every day you earn your right to see the next sunrise. Today marked my 73rd day alone in the high country. The isolation that once seemed overwhelming had become familiar, almost comfortable. Daily rituals of survival had created a rhythm that carried me forward, day by day, through winter's heart, and so the cycle continued, as it had for generations of mountain men before me, as it would for those who came after. In this harsh and beautiful wilderness, we found not just survival, but a profound understanding of our place in the natural world, and perhaps most importantly an understanding of ourselves. The mountains had indeed tested everything I was. In passing those tests, I had found not just survival, but a freedom unlike anything else on earth. And in that freedom, wrapped in buffalo robes with the fire burning steadily through another mountain night, I discovered that the true shelter wasn't just the walls around me, but the knowledge, resilience, and spirit that the mountains themselves had forged within me. This is the legacy of the mountain men, not just techniques for surviving winter, but wisdom about what it means to live deliberately, courageously, and in harmony with forces greater than ourselves. Their knowledge, earned through generations of harsh experience, continues to offer insights relevant far beyond the mountain context, reminding us of our capacity for resilience, our connection to the natural world, and our ability to find profound meaning in the face of extraordinary challenges. Sleep well, knowing that within you lies the same capacity for courage and resilience that allowed these remarkable men to face the deadliest blizzards and emerge with stories that echo through time, stories of human triumph over impossible odds, of wisdom earned through hardship, and of the enduring spirit that enables us to survive and thrive even in our darkest hours.